Um, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about ethics in the context of ICT 4D, but not very much about that because I've never done any ICT 4D research myself, so I'm reluctant to talk about things that I haven't experienced. However, I am on the HREC, the Human Research Ethics Committee at the University of Canberra. In fact, I'm its Deputy Chair, and I've been a long time member of the Ethics Committee for the Australian Computer Society and had a big hand in the writing of its Code of Ethics and the case studies that accompany the Code of Ethics, which is, I hope, used in quite a lot of universities around Australia to kind of teach professional behaviour and that sort of stuff. And I just finished a project in the UK on the on responsible research and innovation in ICT, which has been great fun, and it's really difficult. ICT's got all these little problems, and it's quite slippery. So I'm really pleased to be able to come and talk a little bit about ethics applications and ethics and the sorts of things that go right and wrong. And of course, I'm sorry that Shirley isn't here, but I've got to start off by saying something about ontology because I simply can't resist it. And Ahmed, when he first spoke with me about coming over, said something about ontology, so I thought I'd just have to stick that in. I just can't resist it. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about ontological tools of trade. That is the terminology that we are going to be using in talking about absolutely anything, and try and put that into a bit of context. A little bit about QA of research, some issues, and what I'm trying to do with the University of Canberra's Human Research Ethics Committee at the moment. Because I'm a systems guy, like everyone in the room, an information systems person, and you can't just be operational in these jobs. You've got to go and change the system. I mean, that's what you do as an IS person. Engage, understand, improve. So, let me just do a bit of ontology stuff first. Here is a really simple three worlds model that Shirley spoke about yesterday. It's a traffic. Consider me driving to Goulburn. Here I am driving along. Here are the physical things. It's my car, the speed I'm driving at, the state of the road, signs that I'm passing by, boom, driving along and being very happy with it. Me, this is my cognition. This is my cognition. This is me thinking. It's not my body. And I'm perceiving these things in the physical world that are around me. And that's good. Everything's going very well. Listening to the radio as well. I'm not the only one that is perceiving this. There is a little chap on a motorbike hiding behind a tree, and he perceives my car, my speed, me whizzing past. He goes, Yvonne, chases me down. And then we start to engage in this conversation. So he says to me, excuse me, sir, it seemed to me that you were driving at 230 kilometres in a 110 zone. And I say to him, surely not. So I'm listening to what he's saying, and we exchange words and sentences. Now, in these statements that we are making to each other, we are referring to things. He is referring to my car and to my speed, points these out, and he refers to the Motor Traffic Act. He says, under the Motor Traffic Act, I'm telling you that it is an offence to do X, Y and Z. Now this is a really simple little conversation, yes, but here are some of the information aspects of it. First, there's the gaining of information from the physical world, there's communication, the black lines, and there's reference, referring to other things in our conversation. So these things are all independent of each other, and they are all related through the activity of this interaction. So I say to him eventually, oh look, here's my GPS, and it's got a print function. What I do, I press the print button, and it produces this wonderful little graph of my speed ever since I left the ACT. And it shows never having gone over 110. I say, oh well, you know, this demonstrates that your handheld speed device that you use to measure my speed as I flash by, pass gently by, is obviously not calibrated properly. And so now we've got something else to talk about. A little bit of kind of artificial information processing or computer-based information processing, using its own kind of access to the outside world and producing data. So now, let me draw this background picture in green. This is the three worlds model. This stuff is all physical the physical world. It's stuff that exists there, whether we like it or not. Over here are these cognitive elements, these things that take information and that put out information. These are information processes. This is clearly an information view of the world. And world 3 is the world of information itself. It has a separate existence in this theory from thinking and from physical existence. These are 3 ontologically different categories. They're just different sorts of things, and they're related in some ways. We see across this border and we act across this border as we touch things and move things. We work across this border in our physical existence, from our thinking to the physical world. We make statements and we hear statements and we process those things in an abstract kind of a world, and these things exist regardless of us. Once they're out, as somebody said the other day. I think it might have been Mike. So that's a little example of the 3 worlds model. Mike mentioned semiotics, and here is how the semiotic scale fits with the 3 worlds model. Obviously the material and empirics down in world 1. Symbol and sign, syntax and semantics are the layers within world 3, layers within the information world. And here's the pragmatics, what impact it actually has on somebody's thinking, because that's what information does, the way information works. The way it's operationalised is through thought. So that's the 3 worlds in semiotics. Now let me just expand a little bit on the nature of this world 3. Let's get rid of that. Now, data is the most elementary form of information. So we know that in this room it's 21 degrees. That is a data type statement. The value of an attribute of an object, what you see in a database, structured database field. 21 degrees, and it needs to have an object and an attribute. It's 21 degrees is the measure of the temperature in the room. So the temperature is an attribute and the room is an object. And you need to have an ontology, you need to have a vocabulary, an understanding of objects and relationships in order to be able to make a data statement. You can't have data that's just a number floating in the world. That isn't data, that's just a number. The number 21 is a number, it's not a bit of data. It's only data if it represents something. So we have this data being representative of something, 21 being a representative of the temperature of the room. So this is the first part of our information world, our world 3. These are components that you can separate metadata from data. Debates and vocabularies. We're going to have a chat, as we are. You've got a vocabulary, I've got a vocabulary. They're aligned to a certain degree, sufficient so that we can sometimes understand each other. All other sorts of communications, discussions and chats going on. All other kinds of conceptual structures which sit above the immediate stuff. So this morning Robert mentioned the distinction between particulars and universals. These kinds of things, data and discussions, reports and so on, they're always particular. They're about something in particular, whilst these guys are all about patterns. Patterns which apply to different kinds of particulars. The law. Institutions. There was a discussion yesterday about institutions, about what a university was. And a university is an information object. A university is not one of these things, although it may have buildings and may have people. It's not one of these things. It doesn't think. It is one of these things. It's an information entity, and it continues even though it might change in its physical appearance in what it does. Designs. Social conventions, institutions, cultures and religions, all information entities in this model. When Graham Shanks first saw this, he said to me, "But where's society?" And I said to him, "But what's society?" And he said, so what is society? I mean, this is a really basic model from which you construct more complex things. So society is a construction. It's probably got a place, it's probably got borders, the Australian society, it's probably got physical things about it. It's got lots of these things, it's got lots of these things, it's got lots of those things, it's got all sorts of things in it. It's got lots of subgroups of these things. theories and models, which is what we've been addressing ourselves to during these talks, and I want to pick that up as we go through the ethics part of this talk. Hypotheses and proposals. So we're going to get to research proposals, obviously. And on this scale, the more deliberative kind of aspects of World 3 are over here on the left, and the more organic over here on the left, if I turn around while I'm talking. So there's a scale of deliberative and organic, and similarly formal and informal. So these are much more debatable and much more fluid, whilst these guys are much more rigid and well specified. Ephemeral. Particulars are ephemeral, they come and go, and increasingly stable kinds of ideas. So theories and models are up here, hypotheses down here. And lastly, the particular, universal and generalised between particular and universal, because one of the problems we see is that there may be nothing that we can argue that is actually universal, because we just don't know enough about the universe to be able to say that. We can say that there are different degrees of generality. So you can have a particular, and if you have 5 particulars of the same kind and you generalise something, then you've got an inductive process to produce a generalisation within that space. How far it goes is a matter for testing. So we can generalise further and further and further and further. So we can go up that scale as we find out more about this pattern, if that pattern is going to hold. Now, there were a couple of examples that came up yesterday and today of situations in ICT 4D where this model can be used to just give a bit of context to that. The issue with agricultural products in India, I think Mike presented, where there was a situation where there were bunches of buyers and sellers who were negotiating, and there was a view that an information system in there to help with the market would be a very useful thing to have. The information system is put in place, but unfortunately the information system is built with a set of social conventions of the IS developer which are quite different from the social conventions of the buyers and sellers in this situation. So there's a clear mismatch between the way they operate and the way this system operates. For example, I think Mike highlighted the fact that there's a lot of deception going on in this process, which there is in so many buying and selling situations, but that information systems are predicated on the idea of data, an idea of data being right and being reliable. And yet these negotiations work in a very different way. So it's pretty clear that the data and information flowing around here in black is going to be a different sort to the information that's flowing around in red. And what happens when it fails? We say, there's corruption, there's deception, there's all sorts of things going wrong with this. But in fact, this is working. Maybe it's suboptimal from some perspectives, but it's working. The problem here is that this situation is being analysed by somebody with those red social conventions. So here we have just a wee bit of a problem, it seemed to me. And Robert's comments about eBay, I think, fit into the same sort of a model. That here is an American model of buying and selling being put into a Chinese way of relationship marketing and buying and selling. So I think this model can be quite useful in just giving you a pattern to sit things on. Actually, it can also be useful for a couple of other things, and let me point out one. Yesterday Shirley said, when she had her model up, that you had to have a phenomena that you were looking at, a problem of interest, and had to be interesting. Well, now that's struck a bell with me, because interest doesn't seem to be, to me, an attribute of a phenomenon. Interest is an attribute of an observer. So the question is, in her model, who has the interest? Is it the researcher, or is it the journal reviewer, or is it who is bringing this idea of interest into that model? Because it sure isn't in the phenomena. It's somewhere else. So I think to locate it where she does is a mistake. It's an ontological error. She's attributing things down here, things in the world, to be of interest. That can't be right. Things are of interest to minds. Well, there we go. Oh.
To say that something has interest is like saying something is relevant, or
Yeah,
saying
it is.
something has value. But to ignore who would find it relevant or having value is ridiculous.
Yeah, quite. I totally agree. I think that's what I was trying to say, but you've said it more succinctly.
You said it. I'm just
Oh, good.
trying to find other examples
Yeah.
of attributes which are or are not in the same ontological space.
Yes. Yes, absolutely right. Yeah, so relevance is one of those. You could probably have, as we will see with ethics, a set of criteria. Now, if there was a set of accepted criteria that meant this is how we understand ethics, or this is how we understand relevance, or this is what we understand by interest, then a mind taking those criteria could examine the phenomena and find it to be either in or out, or some shade. But just to say it's interesting is to make a mistake.
Exactly.
And ethics falls into exactly this category because we've got a whole set of ethical kind of rules and guidelines that we apply to situations which might well be quite unethical from somebody else's perspective. Unfortunately, this has stopped operating. Maybe this will work. There we go, all good. So now given that little backdrop on the three worlds model that I just couldn't resist, let's think a little bit about the research cycle. This is seriously a rough diagram just for entertainment purposes. I'm not trying to model the research process. But I am trying to make the point that what we do is a human activity system which is supplemented and supported by lots of different information systems. Our research world can be conceived as just a human activity system. Of course, if you look at research as a human activity system, the support that ICT gives it is so patchy, and the support that IS gives it is so broken up that, if this was an organisation, you'd say, oh, please, get in Mike Hammer and do a bit of work on it. So here is a little picture of a research system from research conception through proposal, data collection, analysis, drafting up the results, examining it and reviewing it, eventually publishing it and getting it into the literature, into the knowledge base, and away we go again. And a little subgroup here that you would hope happened, which is that the knowledge that was created somehow gets massaged for practice and goes in to make a change to the world. Because as Ed rightly says, the top loop doesn't actually change very much, although it might build wonderful things for us and we keep getting paid. That's all very good, but this is where the actual rubber hits the road. This is where we can actually make a difference. So now this is a little research and research to practice cycle then. These seem to me to be the only 2 points at which we can actually intervene in this process to do some quality assurance. X1 and X2. Now X2, the bottom one, is where we go into publications. Now, how many of our journals and how many of our conference conveners actually ask for authors to supply information about the ethics clearance that they've received for their paper? This happens in medicine, that you've got to actually write, this is UC Ethics Clearance 2009/186. That's it. Not in IS and not in IT. Our journals just publish anything really from an ethical perspective. We sort of hope, we may hope, that a reviewer will say, oh, this actually wasn't very good, but who knows? Who knows? Lack of evidence. X1 is up at the beginning, at the proposal stage, and that's where we do have an opportunity, at least in some parts of research, to actually do something about it. So, the way that our universities go about doing something about it is they've set up ethics review boards, IRBs in the US, research ethics committees in the UK and in Australia, the HREC, the Human Research Ethics Committee, as different from the Animal Research Ethics Committee. Universities have both of these things. So these were established after the Second World War and ostensibly because of the abuses that were said to have been perpetrated by Nazi Germany in its medical experimentation, and also by the abuses of the Third World as it was, where people were going in and doing medical research on people who had no voice. And this was felt to be kind of against the ethics of the Western world. And so these committees were established. They expanded little by little, and one of the pivotal points where the reach of the Ethics Committee expanded was the Milgram experiment in the US that you probably have heard about. This is where people, who turned out to be actors, were sitting in a chair and they were told to respond in particular ways to questions that were being asked. Now, the research participants were brought in behind a screen and they had control over electric shocks. And they were told by the researcher, no, he's not doing the right thing, you know, give him a shock. And so there's the participant says, right, gives him a shock, says the guy in the chair. Answer the question now. No, I don't want to answer the question. Give him 300 volts. Oh, he says. And what was being studied here was whether or not these participants would continue to do what they're told, even though they were clearly, apparently, inflicting pain upon this actor. And some of them would have killed him. They just kept doing it. They just kept doing what they were told. So this is a psychological experiment outside of the Ethics Committee, but nobody was harmed in it, except perhaps for the participants who went too far and got a bit embarrassed. No one was actually harmed in it, but it was considered to be unethical research. The fact that it proved that lots of Americans do what they told was also not a very appealing result. So it was expanded into psychology, and then they said, oh, well, if we're going to expand it into non-invasive human participants, let's take over the whole of the social sciences, and all social science work has to go through it. And that's the state we're in now, that anything that involves a human participant has to go through an ethics approval process.
I'd like to ask if that is true in private touch.
No.
No.
This is what I was just hoping to say. That, you know, when you say that, well, ethical clearances in Bangladesh for the last 10 years I'm teaching and have liaised with different organizations. Whenever I wanted to conduct any research, I just send my students, the only top person says that, well, this will be used for academic purpose and no clearance, and we don't have any kind of study.
Yeah. Well, that's right. So I wrote to Felix Tan a month or so ago and asked him about ISS this year, ISS in New Zealand in early December. And I said to Felix, you know, are you requiring people to have ethics clearance when they've done research that had human participants? And he wrote back and said, not only do we not do that, but many of our authors are not in a position where they could possibly do that, because many countries don't have this scheme.
But in the thesis we attached in the UNSW, either the master's or PhD thesis, the data collection, we need to attach the ethics approval and the copy.
You certainly do at
We
UNSW.
have practice here, but not in those
In
things.
Australia, you do it.
But if you're doing research in a developing country through an Australian university, you still do. And they get even more scrutiny than the local ones do. So if you're doing overseas research, the scrutiny is higher than if you're doing it here in Australia. All right. So this is where our quality assurance, our only little lever on quality assurance exists. This is a huge slide. It's just a little story about a... oh, well, can you read that, or should I just... It's just a little story from an excellent paper, interesting paper to me, by Dearden. So this guy, Professor Kant, is an Australian Monash investigator, as I understand it. And this kind of problem with research in Aboriginal communities, the problem that's highlighted here is an interesting one because our HRECs all look at Aboriginal communities as being a community where research must go through the elders and through a whole set of processes before it can be conducted. And yet this says if you go through those kinds of processes, you're likely to miss out on the very people you might be trying to actually research on. So it works well perhaps if you're doing research within that power structure or within a tight community, but it doesn't work at all if you're doing research on the margins of those things. So there are difficulties. Now, ethics evaluation. Here we are, you're the researcher. Here is phenomena that you've detected in the outside world that you are going to research, and you've written up your research proposal based in the knowledge base. So you've collected theories, you've got your proposal, you've got everything straight, you've got your phenomena. Now we'll just put it through the ethics committee. And here is what you're faced with. Fill in an HREC application and make sure that that application meets the local policies of the ethics committee. Make sure it meets the NHMRC National Statement on Ethics. And if you don't know about the Helsinki Declaration and Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a whole raft of other kinds of policies, then they might write back to you saying, please double check with section 72 of the Declaration on Human Rights to which our university subscribes. So this is what you think you're doing, and this is what you have to do in order to carry that out effectively. Not a very happy situation in my book. One WAG wrote that ethics committees look at the relative benefits and relative costs of research. That's one of the things that ethics committees sort of look at lightly. But does anybody look at the cost and benefits of the ethics committee? That is, it costs a heap to produce these things, a lot of effort. Do we get appropriate benefit for that? Maybe the ethics committees are actually unethical in being there at all, which is a quaint comment. So that's the proposal. Now here is the sorts of things that you have to meet from the national statement. Your research must have merit and integrity, must have justice, beneficence and respect. This is with respect to those participants who you're going to be dealing with. And you've got to be able to demonstrate how your research method meets these kinds of criteria. It actually isn't all that hard, but it is something that you have to get your head around. Here are a few examples of difficulties we've had this year at the UC Ethics Committee. We had one proposal for a guy who was going to go to Darfur and interview lots of people who survived the genocide. It was a really difficult proposal and one that was fraught with a lot of risk to the researcher, an impossible degree of risk to the people that they would be talking to, and so it was not approved, and that person didn't conduct that research. An interesting case of mystery shopping. This is where a researcher goes in to in this case it was a particular kind of retail outlet, goes into lots of these, spins a yarn about their mum, blah 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 blah, and takes note of what happens in that interaction. Mystery shopping is where a boss might hire an actor to go and see whether or not their staff is doing the right sorts of things. From an ethical perspective, our problems were that there was deception involved because they never resolved the deception. So it wasn't as though the researcher went in and said, oh, my mum's really sick and I need this, and then at the end said, oh, by the way, I'm actually a researcher from the University of Canberra and I needed to know what you would do, and if I told you that I was a researcher from the University of Canberra, you would have done something different. Right? So I had to deceive you, and I'm really sorry about that. And if you want me simply to destroy this information, which is totally confidential and won't be released to anyone, particularly your boss, then I'm happy to destroy it. They didn't have that in their protocol, and they weren't prepared to do that. So we raised this issue of deception, and they said, no, we're not going to do anything about it. And we said, you can't proceed with the research. It later turned out that there was all sorts of other problems going on with this. They were actually doing that in order to figure out where they wanted to put their interns next semester as well. Now, this is bizarre, that an academic would actually make such a proposal. Anyway.
There are some issues related to ethnography and participant observations. Like, you don't ask questions, but you observe what all people are doing and you make your note. And how do you see that as a ethics committee?
Well, now, this is exactly what an ethics committee would say. I'd need to see the proposal. Because there's millions of ways of putting this, and some of those ways would be seen as being respectful of the people that were being observed, and some of them wouldn't be. So it is really difficult.
Yeah.
And I reckon...
You don't know, like what you are writing actually. Like, you observe and you write your note, you go back home and start writing whatever you have observed.
And if it's all in public?
Certainly our experience, because I've been on our ethics panel down here, which reports to the bigger ethics panel up at Kensington, even more contentious areas and so on. And we've got a few areas such as armed robots and so on, which have some interesting ethical in the topic, not only in the process for carrying out research. Should we ever research into fully armed autonomous robots?
Now, did that go through the ethics committee, did it?
No.
Right, yeah.
The ethics committee in Kensington, when we put it up to as a hypothetical,
Oh, yeah.
to anticipate, couldn't come to any conclusion.
Well, it's outside their scope, and that's one of the things I'm going to try and finish with, because I think we do need to shake this up. Well, a lot of this isn't that good. A case on transgender. This person wanted to run focus groups, and that became really difficult because, well, for various sorts of reasons. That one did go ahead, but it wasn't as focus groups. It was done on a one-off set of interviews and that sort of thing. And there was one on prostitution, which had the difficulty of uncovering potentially reportable illegal activity, because we are supposed to report to the police if we see something that is illegal. Well, it's a grey area, but if you're in a university doing work on behalf of the university under a university banner, then the university says don't take the risk. You see something illegal, you do something about it. You're obliged. We say, oh, well, this is a bit awkward. So how are we going to frame this piece of research to avoid that difficulty? And that caused us some trouble. The idea here is just to give a flavour of the kinds of things that work with these criteria. So, 3 ideas about changing the way our Human Research Ethics Committee operates. The first one, why is ethics seen as separate from research? You know, you've got to produce an ethics application. Well, I and some of my colleagues, but not a majority yet, but I'm getting there, feel that this is actually the wrong thing, that ethics is an attribute of an action. Ethics isn't something separate to an action. Ethics is an attribute of an action. Ethics has got to be built into the research protocol. You don't want a separate ethics application. You want ethics in that research protocol. So what we want to see is an ethics presentation, which is the proposal, which is the protocol itself. And then the ethics issues are highlighted to say where in the proposal they have been addressed. None of this separate application. Because the proposal might be over here and it might be this big and have all this sort of stuff in it. The ethics application might be this big and has certain kinds of extracts from it. We don't see the whole proposal. We don't see it in its entirety, the way it's going to operate. Now that's wrong. We need to see it, not extracts, not bullshit. And I use bullshit in the technical term there. There's a lovely little book called On Bullshit. If you ever see it, it's just an excellent little book. Anyway, very short, yeah, very short, written by a Princeton professor of moral philosophy. It's an excellent little book. Okay, so that's what we'd like to try doing. Wouldn't it be better if you were able to submit your proposal And if there are ethical problems in the proposal, wouldn't it be better if they were fixed in the proposal? Not having an application which we make comments on, and then it gets fixed and moderated, but this doesn't change at all. This proposal is still executed the way it was designed. No good? No good. So that's one thing I think we should change. Simple. Now here's something that's a little harder. Consequential ethics. Most ethic thinking is based in consequences. There's only one kind of, well, two kinds of ethical thinking that is about the act itself. Most ethical thinking is about the consequences of the act, that an act is good or bad because of what happens as a result of it, not because of it in itself. So the Kantians amongst us will just have to close your eyes for a moment. So why is it, if that's what ethics is about, why is it that most ICT projects don't have to go to an ethics committee? A lot of ICT projects don't have human participants, so don't have to go to an ethics committee, but they can have huge human impacts. Why don't we actually subject those to an ethics committee? So, I reckon we're up for broadening. And lastly, there are other aspects of scope which sort of slightly puzzle me. We put quite a lot of attention into things that don't deserve much looking at. Simple internet-based surveys that don't collect sensitive information. You'd have to wonder. They should be registered somewhere, but they don't need to be looked at. There's lots of research-like activity that goes on, and we have this big grey area in research training and in projects, particularly in Australia now that the AQF is requiring advanced degrees to be research-based, right? To have research projects and research methods training in them. So we're training up all of these people. And how do you train up people? Well, they run little research projects just to test methods and to see how things actually operate. So we've had the situation of a complaint from a public servant who says, I was interviewed by a guy from ANU last week on this topic, which I think was something to do with portfolio management. And I was interviewed by a UC guy the following week, and the first one I had to sign a consent form, and the second one I didn't. Why is that? Is UC a slack organisation or what? And the answer was that this guy was doing a PhD, and this guy was doing a coursework course. So not required to have ethics approval. So he didn't have a consent form, didn't have an information sheet. Not good, not good. So the UC Ethics Committee is trying to figure out how it can expand its ethics practice across into these sort of vaguer areas. And of course, it raises the question of professional ethics. Why do we do this sort of stuff with research? What's so special about research? Research would have to be one of the more benign of the kinds of activities that people get up to. Why not management and administration? Why don't their proposals go through this as well? Why aren't they subject to ethical vetting? What's so special about research as a human activity? Well, that's won me a lot of friends as well. So I just want to conclude. What I'm really interested in is the quality of research, that research is done really well. And I've been talking about the way it's being done, like the ethical attributes of human action. But I just want to turn to what is actually produced, the product of it. And sadly, these things are a bit confused. You know, I hear a bit about interpretivism and that sort of stuff, as though it is a product, when in fact it's a process. Simple ontological mistake. As Robert said, was it Robert perhaps? Said this morning, maybe it wasn't, that we all interpret things. That's the way we work. Interpret is a verb, you know, that's what you're doing. You're applying methods and all that sort of stuff to your perceptions of phenomena. This is interpreting it, sense-making it and building something. But that's not the product. The product is a set of concepts and relationships, namely a theory or a descriptive theory or some kind of a thing. The product is always World 3. The product is always a set of concepts and relationships. There's nothing interpretive about that. It is what it is. It's a World 3 entity. And it's separate from the interpretation that goes on in the mind. in order to produce that thing. So this is all a bit of a furphy, this interpretive stuff. Forget it. We all do it, and it's got nothing to do with product. So soundness of research. So you look at your product, you look at those concepts that you've put out, and you can subject them to an ontological sort of quality path. Is it ontologically sound? Are the concepts well defined? Are they well separated? And if they're fuzzy, do we know how they interrelate? Are they ordinal concepts? Are they part of a spectrum? What kind of concepts have we got there? Have we got the whole scene? Have we picked out a variable to study, like they do in TAM? There's these little variables, context free. Now, that's not going to work. How are you going to have any idea whether these variables are the complete spectrum of variables along in that little space? You're never going to know. You've got to do context work. So there are ancient people in this room like me who, back in the 70s, were influenced by a bloke named Tom DeMarco. Tom DeMarco was a systems analyst, and he invented data flow diagrams, essentially. He said, when you're doing an analysis, you don't just talk about the situation you're looking at, you've got to talk about the situation around all of that and push it out as far as it needs to go before you're convinced that there's absolutely nothing in it. You've got to go out. You've got to, if you're old like me and live in Australia, you've probably had a basal cell carcinoma cut out at times, like happens to me from time to time. There's little skin cancer, right? And they cut it out. And they cut out 6 cells around the outside and around the bottom of it to ensure they've got it. They've got the context. Just the same as DeMarco, and that's what ontologies have to have as well. This idea of presenting 4 or 5 variables and saying that accounts for things, that's rubbish. Sorry. Unsound ontologically, I don't mean rubbish. Value. Does it contribute to our understanding of our world, world 1, or ourselves, world 2 perhaps, but world 1 essentially, and is it well represented in world 3? What's so hard about that? That's the value of the thing. We've got a better description of something in the world. And lastly, impacts. Are people going to be able to act in a more knowledgeable and well-informed fashion as a result of my work? If they are, go ahead, well done. If they're not, think again. So there's a bit of a rundown.
I hate this part of my responsibility of stopping what I think is a useful and fascinating discussion. It's the second time I've had to do it today. But we need to make room for the next fascinating and useful discussion, I'm afraid. So again, on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much indeed, Craig.
That's a great pleasure. Thank you.